The earliest recorded associations between this particular territory and organized human settlement belong to a period when ownership, in the modern legal sense, did not yet exist in any codified form. What existed instead were rights of use, of passage, of cultivation, and of protection, distributed across a layered social hierarchy that bound individuals to land through obligation rather than title. The families and local lords who held influence over this ground did so through a combination of military capacity, agricultural productivity, and political relationship with whatever central authority governed the wider region. The land was not merely property, it was position. As feudal structures consolidated across the centuries, the territory began to acquire the kind of recorded identity that allows historians to trace it with greater precision. Charters, ecclesiastical records, and early administrative documents placed the land within a named estate or holding, governed by a succession of families whose prominence rose and fell in correspondence with the political fortunes of the age. Some held it briefly, their names surviving only in marginal notations within monastic registers. Others maintained their grip across several generations, building modest structures, clearing woodland, and establishing the agricultural patterns that would define the land's productive character for centuries to come. The physical appearance of the estate in this early period would have been modest by later standards, perhaps a fortified house or a modest hall surrounded by agricultural outbuildings, orchards, and enclosed pasture, but its social meaning was already established. The region in which this land sat was itself of considerable political importance. It lay within a zone where competing interests, whether between crown and nobility, between neighboring territorial powers, or between secular and ecclesiastical authority, intersected with enough frequency to make its governance a matter of ongoing negotiation. Roads of ancient origin passed through or near its boundaries, connecting markets and administrative centers in ways that gave the territory commercial as well as strategic relevance. Travelers, merchants, and military movements had long made use of the same natural corridors that made the land attractive to those who wished to build upon it. The estate, when it eventually came into being, would not exist in isolation. It would occupy a precise point within a web of roots, relationships, and historical forces that had been active for far longer than any building it would contain. The cultural world surrounding the land in the centuries before the estate's construction was one shaped by clear hierarchies of faith, obligation, and tradition. The church maintained a significant presence in the organization of rural life, with nearby ecclesiastical foundations holding influence over land use, education, and the rhythms of the agricultural calendar. The nobility expressed their status through a combination of military service, patronage, and architectural investment, and the aspiration to build in a manner that communicated permanence was already deeply embedded in the social imagination of the period. To commission a house was not simply a practical act, it was a declaration of belonging to a particular place, a particular lineage, and a particular understanding of one's position within the natural order of social life. By the time the conditions for the estate's construction began to materialize, the land had already passed through enough hands and enough historical episodes to carry a layered significance that no single family could entirely claim for themselves. The soil had been worked by generations whose names were not recorded. The boundaries had been disputed, redrawn, and contested through both legal process and physical force. The trees that would eventually shade the estate's formal gardens were already ancient. The streams that would be redirected into ornamental channels had been running their original courses for centuries. The land, in other words, arrived at the moment of the estate's creation with a history of its own, one that the house would inherit whether or not its builders were conscious of it. It is worth pausing, at the beginning of this story, to consider what it means for an estate to be described as forgotten. The word implies an active process, not simply the passage of time, but the gradual withdrawal of attention, documentation, and memory from something that once occupied a central position in the life of a community or a class. The land on which this estate stands was never obscure in its own time. It was known, valued, and contested. The families who held it understood its worth with complete clarity. The laborers who worked it understood its demands with equal precision. What happened over the long course of the history that follows was not that the land ceased to matter, but that the structures through which it had mattered, the imperial frameworks, the aristocratic systems, the social codes that gave an estate its meaning, gradually dissolved around it, leaving the land itself standing in a kind of historical silence. That silence is the subject of this documentary. It begins here with the ground itself, before the house, before the family, before the rise and the long descent that this story will trace. It begins with the particular quality of light that falls across an open plain in the early morning, with the sound of water moving through ancient ground, and with the simple fact that some places accumulate history the way that other places accumulate stone, slowly, patiently, and with a weight that outlasts almost everything built upon them. There is a particular kind of building that does not simply shelter its occupants, but speaks on their behalf. It addresses the world in the language of stone and proportion, of symmetry and ornament, making arguments about status, permanence, and authority that no written document could quite replicate. The estate at the center of this story was precisely this kind of building. From the earliest stages of its conception, its purpose was not merely residential, it was rhetorical. Every decision made in its design, the height of its entrance hall, the width of its principal facade, the alignment of its formal gardens with the surrounding landscape, was a considered statement about the family that commissioned it and the world they intended to occupy. The commissioning of the estate belongs to a moment when architecture had become one of the primary instruments through which the aristocracy and the emerging landed gentry expressed their position within the social order. To build on a significant scale was to participate in a visual conversation that stretched across the country and, in many cases, across continental Europe. Patrons were acutely aware of what their peers were building, and they engaged architects with an understanding that the resulting structure would be read and interpreted by an audience of social equals and superiors. The choice of architect was therefore as significant as the choice of site. It carried implications about taste, ambition, and the degree to which the patron wished to align themselves with prevailing or fashionable currents of architectural thought. The architect brought to this commission a training and sensibility shaped by the dominant traditions of the period. Whether drawing on the classical vocabulary of ancient Rome filtered through Renaissance interpretation, or on the more restrained and mathematically precise language of Palladian design, the guiding principles were ones of order, balance, and the careful subordination of ornament to structure. The facade presented to the world was composed with an attention to ratio and rhythm that reflected a deeply held belief in the relationship between beauty and geometry. Windows were spaced with deliberate regularity. Cornices and pilasters articulated the surface without overwhelming it. The roofline was managed with a calm authority that suggested solidity rather than spectacle. The construction itself was a substantial undertaking that involved a wide network of craftsmen, laborers, and suppliers operating under the supervision of a clerk of works or master builder, responsible for translating architectural drawings into physical reality. The primary building material was sourced locally where possible, stone quarried from nearby outcroppings or brick fired in temporary kilns established on or near the estate grounds, though certain refined elements required materials brought from greater distances. Carved stonework for the principal entrance, decorative plasterwork for the interior ceilings, and the oak or walnut used for the principal staircase and paneling all reflected the patron's willingness to invest in quality that would endure well beyond their own lifetime. The pace of construction was measured rather than hurried, typically extending across several years as the complexity of the work demanded patience and skilled attention at every stage. The principal rooms of the estate were arranged according to a social logic as precise as the architectural geometry that framed them. The entrance hall served as both a threshold and a declaration, its height and proportions calibrated to produce a specific impression upon the visitor before they had taken more than a few steps inside. The staterooms that followed, the drawing room, the dining room, the library, each occupied a distinct place within a carefully considered sequence designed to guide guests through a graduated experience of the household's refinement and resources. Portraits of ancestors lined the walls, not simply as personal remembrance, but as evidence of lineage, a visual argument for the legitimacy and depth of the family's claim to the position they occupied. The furniture, the silver, the imported textiles, and the accumulated objects of travel and patronage all contributed to an interior that was as much an argument as it was a home. The gardens that extended beyond the house were conceived as a continuation of the architectural project rather than a departure from it. In the formal garden tradition of the period, nature was organized according to the same principles of symmetry and proportion that governed the building itself. Parterres were laid out in geometric patterns visible from the principal reception rooms, reinforcing the impression of a landscape brought under the same disciplined control as the household it surrounded. Avenues of trees were planted along deliberate axes, directing the eye outward toward carefully framed views of the wider estate. Water features, whether formal canals, reflecting pools, or fountains, introduced both visual and auditory elements that complemented the stillness of stone and gravel with something more animated and sensory. The garden required as much skilled labor as the building and was understood by contemporaries to be an equally significant expression of its owner's judgment and means. What the estate communicated, taken as a whole, was a specific vision of order, social, aesthetic, and moral. The building and its grounds argued that the family who occupied them understood the world correctly, valued the right things, and possessed the resources and refinement to translate those values into physical form. It was an architecture of confidence, produced at a moment when the social structures that supported such confidence appeared stable and self-sustaining. The style was not innovatory, it was not intended to be. Its purpose was to locate the estate within a tradition of building that carried authority precisely because it was recognized and respected. Innovation in this context would have suggested instability. What the patron wanted and what the architect delivered was a building that looked as though it had always been there, as though the family and the land and the house were a single, continuous fact of the world rather than a construction of particular historical circumstances. That sense of permanence was, of course, a carefully cultivated illusion. All architecture is in some measure a form of optimism, a wager placed against the passage of time. The estate was built to last, and in purely material terms, much of it did. But the world that gave it meaning, the social grammar through which its proportions and ornaments were read and understood, would prove far less durable than the stone in which it was expressed. Every great estate has at its foundation not simply a building, but a family, a particular constellation of individuals whose ambitions, alliances, and accumulated decisions gave the property its character and its meaning. The house provided the form, the family provided the force, and in the case of this estate, the relationship between the two was so thoroughly interwoven across generations that it becomes difficult at a certain point to speak of one without immediately invoking the other. The estate was not merely where the family lived, it was how they understood themselves, a physical expression of their place in the world, maintained and enlarged with the same deliberate attention they gave to their political relationships and their financial arrangements. The origins of the family stretch back to a period when the mechanisms of social advancement were more direct and more openly transactional than later generations would care to acknowledge. Land was the primary currency of power, and the means by which it was acquired, military service, advantageous marriage, royal favor, legal maneuvering, or the straightforward purchase of a neighboring holding from a family in financial difficulty, were understood by contemporaries as legitimate instruments of ambition rather than causes for reflection. The founding figures of this lineage were men and women who understood their historical moment with considerable clarity. They recognized which relationships required cultivation, which alliances carried long-term value, and which opportunities, once passed, would not present themselves again. This was not cynicism. It was the practical intelligence of a class whose survival depended on reading the political landscape with accuracy and acting within it with discipline. The early generations established their position through a combination of military distinction and administrative service. Titles came gradually, each one representing not simply an honor but a formal acknowledgement of the family's place within the hierarchy of the state. A baronetcy secured in one generation was followed, in time, by a more substantial elevation, an earldom, a viscountcy, or a seat in the upper chamber of the legislature that brought with it both prestige and access. Access was, in many respects, the more valuable of the two. To be present in the rooms where decisions were made, to be known by name to those who controlled patronage and policy, to have one's letters read rather than set aside. These were the practical advantages that titles conferred, and the family pursued them with the methodical patience of those who think in generations rather than years. Land accumulation proceeded in parallel with political advancement, and the two processes reinforced each other in ways that were well understood at the time. Each new parcel acquired added to the family's rental income, which in turn funded the legal costs, the travel, the hospitality, and the personal presentation that political life required. The estate at the center of this story grew not in a single decisive act of purchase, but through a long series of additions, a field here, a woodland there, a neighboring farm absorbed when its owner's fortunes turned, a distant manor acquired through the settlement of a debt or the terms of a marriage contract. By the time the principal house was built, the estate had already achieved a scale that reflected decades of careful accumulation rather than a single moment of founding. Marriage was among the most consequential instruments in the family's long ascent, and the records of their matrimonial history read as a careful map of the social and political landscape of each successive generation. Alliances were formed with families whose geographic or political position complemented the family's own, a union with a northern family that brought additional acreage and a parliamentary seat, a marriage into a mercantile family of the capital that introduced capital and commercial relationships alongside the more traditional assets of land and title. The women who married into this lineage brought with them not only dowries but connections, and in several documented cases, it was the network introduced through a wife's family that proved decisive in a moment of political difficulty or financial constraint. Their contributions, though less visible in the formal record, were no less structural. The family's relationship with the ruling powers of their era was managed with consistent care. They were neither reckless in their opposition nor servile in their loyalty, having learned early that both extremes carried risk. When the political order shifted, as it did in the centuries this story covers, with considerable regularity, they possessed the flexibility to reposition themselves without sacrificing their essential interests. They supported the crown when support was prudent, aligned with parliamentary forces when that alignment offered greater security, and navigated the theological and constitutional upheavals of their age with a pragmatism that preserved both their property and their standing. This was not opportunism in the pejorative sense, but something more considered, a long view of institutional survival that placed the continuity of the family and the estate above the demands of any particular political moment. The estate itself absorbed all of this history and reflected it back in material form. Each significant addition to the house, a new wing, an extended library, a remodeled reception room, corresponded to a period of increased wealth or political confidence. The portraits that lined the principal gallery were not merely decorative, they were a chronological argument, each canvas representing a generation that had received the estate, maintained it, and passed it forward with something added. The family understood, with the clarity that only those who have built something across multiple lifetimes can possess, that an estate is never truly finished. It is always in the process of becoming, always carrying the accumulated weight of what has already been done, while remaining open to whatever the next generation will require of it. To stand in the entrance hall of this estate at the height of the family's influence was to stand inside a very particular version of history, one carefully selected, carefully arranged, and carefully maintained. The silences in that history, the transactions not recorded, and the alliances not displayed were as much a part of the family's story as the portraits and the titles, but the estate held all of it, the visible and the invisible alike within its walls. There are periods in the life of a great estate when everything functions as it was designed to function, when the household economy operates with quiet efficiency, when the social calendar fills and empties with predictable regularity, and when the building itself seems to justify, through the sheer completeness of its operation, every stone laid in its construction. For this estate, that period represented the fullest expression of what the family had spent generations assembling. It was not a moment of sudden arrival, but rather the sustained condition of a household that had achieved through accumulated effort and inherited advantage a kind of institutional maturity. The estate, at this point in its history, was no longer simply a house, it was a system. The household economy that sustained daily life on the estate was considerable in both scale and complexity. At its center was the house itself, staffed by a hierarchy of domestic servants whose roles were precisely defined and whose movements through the building followed patterns established by long tradition. The butler presided over the principal floors with an authority that was simultaneously practical and ceremonial, managing the wine cellars, the silver, the formal dining arrangements, and the presentation of the household to its guests. The housekeeper governed the domestic interior with equivalent command, overseeing the linen rooms, the kitchen quarters, the cleaning rotations, and the training of the younger female staff. Below them extended a structured order of footmen, ladies' maids, housemaids, kitchen staff, and the various specialized servants whose particular skills, the pastry cook, the French chef engaged for the season, the still-room maid who managed preserves and medicinal preparations, reflected the ambitions of a household that took its domestic standards seriously. Beyond the walls of the house, the estate supported an equally elaborate exterior economy. Head gardeners directed teams of under-gardeners and seasonal laborers whose work maintained the formal gardens, the kitchen gardens, the orchid houses, and the woodland walks that gave the estate its characteristic appearance across the changing seasons. The home farms supplied the household with dairy produce, meat, and vegetables, managed by a bailiff whose agricultural knowledge was considered as essential to the estate's functioning as the butler's knowledge of wine. Gamekeepers maintained the shooting grounds, stable hands managed the carriage horses and hunters, and a carpenter and blacksmith retained permanently on the estate ensured that the constant small requirements of a large working property were addressed without delay. The estate, in this respect, resembled a self-contained settlement more than a private residence, a community organized around the needs and the identity of a single family. The tenant system extended the estate's reach beyond its immediate grounds and into the surrounding countryside. Farms of varying size were let to tenant families on terms that had often remained broadly consistent across several generations, creating relationships of economic dependency and social obligation that shaped the character of the wider community. The family was expected to fulfill certain duties toward their tenants, maintaining the fabric of farm buildings, providing assistance in times of hardship, arbitrating disputes, and representing tenant interests in dealings with distant administrative authorities. In return, the tenants provided the rental income that formed a significant portion of the estate's annual revenue and contributed to the labor force that the home farm and seasonal operations required. These were relationships of considerable intimacy, despite their formal inequality, and the estate's reputation in the locality depended in large measure on how conscientiously its owners discharged their obligations within them. The social life of the estate during its golden age was structured around a calendar that moved between the London season and extended periods of residence in the country, each phase carrying its own rituals and requirements. The autumn shooting parties that drew guests from the highest levels of political and aristocratic society to the estate were events of considerable logistical complexity, requiring weeks of preparation by the domestic staff, the gamekeepers, and the kitchen. Guests arrived with their own servants, their own horses, and their own expectations of comfort and entertainment, and the household expanded temporarily to accommodate a world within a world. The dining table at which these gatherings concluded each day was as much a political space as a social one, a place where alliances were tested, opinions circulated, and the informal currency of influence was exchanged across the candlelight and the crystal. The political figures who passed through the estate's gates during these years represented the active center of the national life of the period. Cabinet ministers, members of the legislature, senior military officers, foreign diplomats, and the occasional member of the royal household all moved through the principal rooms, adding to the estate's reputation as a place where the business of the country was conducted alongside its pleasures. The family understood the value of this association and maintained it with deliberate care, ensuring that the house was always in a condition of readiness for guests of consequence and that the hospitality offered was of a quality that reflected well on their position. The estate, in this sense, served as a kind of private embassy, a place where the formal structures of the political world were temporarily relaxed without being suspended, allowing conversations and negotiations to proceed in an atmosphere of apparent leisure. The physical environment of the estate during this period bore the full weight of the family's investment and attention. The principal rooms were maintained with an exactness that reflected both pride and purpose, their contents arranged and rearranged according to the season, the nature of the expected guests, and the particular use to which each space would be put. The light that fell through the tall windows of the drawing room in the late afternoon illuminated surfaces of polished mahogany, gilded picture frames, and carefully arranged porcelain with the particular warmth that only a well-tended interior can produce. Outside, the gardens moved through their seasonal rhythms with a precision that suggested to the observer the effortless abundance of a place entirely at ease with itself. It was, by all evidence available to the historian, a world of considerable completeness. The estate in its golden age asked nothing of those who occupied it except that they continue, that they sustain what had been built, honor the obligations it carried, and pass it forward in the condition in which they had received it. For a time, that appeared entirely possible. In the world that produced and sustained estates of this kind, marriage was never simply a private arrangement between two individuals. It was a transaction of considerable public consequence, a mechanism through which land was consolidated or divided, through which debts were settled or contracted, and through which the social position of a family was either confirmed or significantly altered. The families who built and maintained great estates understood this with a clarity that later generations, inheriting more romantic notions of matrimonial choice, would sometimes find difficult to fully appreciate. To marry well was not a matter of personal fortune alone. It was a responsibility to the estate itself, to the accumulated investment of previous generations, and to the expectations of those who would come after. The house, in this sense, had an interest in every union contracted beneath its roof. The earliest marriages recorded within this family's history reflect the priorities of a lineage still in the process of establishing itself. The brides and grooms of the founding generations were selected with an eye toward geographic consolidation, toward the absorption of neighboring properties, the resolution of boundary disputes that had persisted across decades, and the creation of a territorial coherence that individual inheritance alone could not easily achieve. A marriage to the daughter of an adjacent land-owning family brought with it not only a dowry of modest financial value, but the eventual prospect of inheriting land that lay directly between two existing parcels of the estate, completing a connection that had long been strategically desirable. These were not romantic calculations, but they were rational ones, and the estate that resulted from their accumulated effect was measurably larger and more coherent than any single inheritance could have produced. As the family's position became more established and their social reach extended beyond the immediate locality, the criteria governing matrimonial selection shifted in emphasis without fundamentally changing in nature. Geographic consolidation remained a consideration, but it was joined by a growing attention to political alignment, to the prestige of the prospective family, and to the financial resources, whether in the form of liquid capital, commercial interests, or rentable urban property that a well-chosen alliance could introduce. The marriage of one generation's eldest son to the daughter of a family with significant parliamentary connections brought with it not only a substantial settlement, but access to a network of political relationships that proved useful across several subsequent decades. The estate benefited from this alliance in ways that extended well beyond the initial financial terms of the contract. The legal architecture of these arrangements was as carefully constructed as the physical architecture of the house itself. Marriage settlements, drawn up by solicitors representing both families, specified with considerable precision the disposition of property in the event of death, the provision made for younger children, the extent of the wife's independent income, and the conditions under which the estate could be sold, mortgaged, or otherwise encumbered. The strict settlement, a legal instrument widely employed by landed families of the period, was designed specifically to prevent any single generation from disposing of the estate's core assets in ways that would disadvantage their successors. It bound the property to the family line with a legal permanence that was intended to outlast individual judgment and individual circumstance. The estate was, in the most literal legal sense, held in trust, not owned outright by any living person, but administered on behalf of a lineage that extended indefinitely into the future. Not all of the marriages contracted across the estate's history proceeded according to plan or produced the outcomes that had been anticipated. Several unions that appeared advantageous at the time of their negotiation became complicated by circumstances that no settlement could have fully anticipated. The premature death of an heir before the terms of inheritance had been fully resolved, the failure of a merchant family's fortune in the years following a wedding that had been partly motivated by that fortune's apparent solidity, or the legal disputes that arose when the terms of a settlement were interpreted differently by the two families involved after the death of the original contracting parties. These complications did not destabilize the estate in any fundamental sense, but they introduced into its history a series of legal proceedings, renegotiated arrangements, and quietly managed difficulties that left traces in the estate's documentary record and occasionally in its financial condition. The women who entered this family through marriage occupied a position of considerable complexity within the household and the wider social structure it represented. The formal legal framework of the period assigned to a married woman a status that subordinated her independent interests to those of her husband and, by extension, to those of the estate. Her dowry became part of the estate's financial resources upon marriage. Her personal property, with certain carefully negotiated exceptions, passed under her husband's legal control. And yet, the practical reality of life within a large household frequently gave women of intelligence and character a degree of influence that the formal legal picture does not easily convey. The management of the domestic interior, the maintenance of social relationships that sustained the family's position, the education of children, and the cultivation of the cultural life of the house were all areas in which women exercised genuine authority, and several of the most significant improvements to the estate's interior and gardens during this period are attributable to the taste and direction of the women who occupied it. The passage of the estate through generations was, in the end, neither smooth nor entirely predictable. Each transition of ownership brought with it a renegotiation of the terms under which the property was held, a reassessment of its financial condition, and a fresh set of decisions about what to preserve, what to improve, and what to quietly set aside. Some generations received the estate in a relatively prosperous condition and passed it forward enriched. Others inherited complications, financial, legal, or familial, that consumed much of their tenure in management rather than advancement. The estate absorbed it all, as great houses tend to do, registering each generation's contribution in its additions and alterations visible in its fabric, and carrying forward in its structure and its silences the full complexity of the history that had produced it. An estate of this kind was never truly separate from the world beyond its boundaries, however much its design and its daily rhythms might have suggested otherwise. The long avenues that approached the house, the walls that enclosed its gardens, and the carefully managed landscape that extended in every direction from its principal facade all created an impression of self-containment, of a world complete within its own borders and largely indifferent to the turbulence of the age. But this impression, however convincingly maintained, was a construction rather than a reality. The estate's prosperity, its legal standing, its social authority, and the very framework of obligations and privileges within which it operated were all products of political arrangements that existed far beyond its gates, and that were, across the period this story covers, subject to pressures and transformations of considerable magnitude. The empire of which this estate formed a component part had reached by the midpoint of its history a condition of institutional complexity that made it simultaneously impressive and vulnerable. Its administrative reach extended across territories that required constant management, significant military expenditure, and the maintenance of a bureaucratic infrastructure whose costs grew steadily with each decade of expansion. The revenues generated by trade, taxation, and colonial extraction were substantial, but they were matched by obligations that left the imperial finances in a state of permanent tension between ambition and resource. The landed families who occupied estates like this one were participants in this system at multiple levels, as recipients of the social order it sustained, as contributors to the political institutions through which it was governed, and as investors whose fortunes were bound, in ways both direct and indirect, to the continued functioning of the whole. The wars that punctuated the era were the most immediately visible expression of the pressures under which the empire operated. Each conflict drew upon the human and financial resources of the landed class in ways that left measurable traces in estate records and family histories. Younger sons entered military service as a matter of course, and the losses sustained in distant campaigns or European theaters of war were absorbed by families with the stoic resignation that their social position both required and, to some degree, produced. The financial costs were less dramatically visible but no less significant. War taxation, the disruption of agricultural markets, the inflation that accompanied prolonged military expenditure, and the periodic contraction of credit all affected the estate's revenues in ways that its administrators worked quietly to manage. The estate continued to function, to present its polished exterior to the world, and to fulfill its social obligations, but the margins within which it operated were, in certain periods, considerably narrower than its appearance suggested. Constitutional shifts of the era introduced a different kind of pressure, one that operated more slowly than war, but with an ultimately more structural effect on the position of families such as this one. The gradual redistribution of political power away from the hereditary landowning class and toward a broader electorate, the reform of parliamentary representation that weakened the influence of landed patrons over the selection of legislators, and the expansion of the administrative state into areas that had previously been managed through the informal authority of local landowners, all altered, incrementally, the terms on which the estate's social power rested. These changes did not announce themselves with the sudden clarity of a military defeat. They accumulated quietly, each reform appearing manageable in isolation, their combined effect becoming apparent only over the course of several decades. The family adopted to each individual adjustment with the pragmatism that had characterized their approach to political change across generations, but the cumulative direction of these adjustments was one that consistently narrowed the sphere within which inherited land and title automatically conferred political authority. The revolutionary currents that moved through Europe during this period reached the estate not as physical upheaval, but as intellectual and social unease. The ideas that circulated in the capitals of the continent concerning the legitimacy of inherited privilege, the rights of those who labored on land they did not own, and the proper relationship between property and political representation found their way into the drawing rooms and libraries of estates like this one through newspapers, pamphlets, correspondence, and the conversations of guests whose own positions gave them reasons to engage seriously with arguments that others might have preferred to dismiss. The family's response to these currents was not uniform across generations. Some engaged with reformist ideas with genuine intellectual curiosity, recognizing that the structures that sustained their position would need to adapt if they were to survive. Others retreated into a more defensive posture, treating any challenge to the existing order as an existential threat rather than an invitation to reconsideration. The first signs of institutional strain within the family itself began to surface during this period of external pressure, though they were not yet severe enough to threaten the estate's fundamental continuity. disagreements about how to manage the estate's finances in a changing economic environment, tensions between the desire to maintain traditional standards of hospitality and the need to reduce expenditure, and differing assessments of how actively to engage with the political changes underway, all introduced a degree of internal friction that the estate's earlier generations, operating in more stable conditions, had not been required to navigate in the same form. These were not ruptures. They were the ordinary frictions of an institution under moderate stress, managed, for the most part, within the estate's established patterns of decision-making. What the political world beyond the gates was producing across this entire period was a gradual renegotiation of the terms on which estates like this one existed. The empire that had created the conditions for the family's rise was not collapsing, it was transforming, redistributing its authority and its resources according to a logic that placed decreasing value on the specific form of inherited landed power that the estate represented. The house continued to stand. The gardens continued to be maintained. The social calendar continued to unfold with its customary regularity. But the world in which all of this took place was, by degrees, a different world, one that would eventually require a different kind of response than any previous generation had been asked to provide. There is a particular quality of silence that settles over financial difficulty when it occurs within institutions built upon the appearance of permanence. It is not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of careful management, of decisions made quietly, of conversations conducted in private, of numbers recorded in ledgers that circulated among solicitors and estate agents, but rarely reached the principal rooms where the family continued to receive guests, maintain their table, and present to the world the unaltered face of prosperity. The estate, during the decades in which its financial pressures accumulated most significantly, looked very much as it had always looked. The gardens were maintained. The house was heated and staffed. The carriages were kept in serviceable condition. What changed was not the surface, but the foundation beneath it, and the distance between those two things grew across this period with a gradual persistence that no single year's accounts could fully capture. The costs of maintaining an estate of this scale were, by any honest accounting, formidable. The wages of the domestic and outdoor staff represented a fixed annual obligation that continued regardless of fluctuations in agricultural income. The maintenance of the principal house, its roof, its guttering, its windows, its internal plasterwork and timber, required constant expenditure simply to prevent deterioration, and any significant repair or improvement added substantially to the burden. The heating of rooms that had been designed for an era of abundant and inexpensive fuel became, as the decades progressed, a more considerable expense than earlier generations would have anticipated. Insurance, legal fees, the costs of participation in the London season, the maintenance of a secondary residence, the education of children at the institutions their class required, all of these accumulated into an annual expenditure that the estate's revenues were, in certain periods, structurally unable to meet. The agricultural changes of the era struck at the foundations of the estate's income with a consistency and a thoroughness that no individual management decision could adequately address. The opening of international grain markets, accelerated by improvements in transportation and the gradual dismantling of protective tariffs, introduced competition from producers operating on a scale and at a cost that the traditional English tenant farm could not match. Rental incomes, which had formed the reliable core of the estate's revenue across multiple generations, came under sustained downward pressure as tenant farmers found themselves unable to sustain the rents they had previously paid. Requests for reductions arrived at the estate office with increasing frequency, and a landlord who refused them risked losing tenants entirely and being left with unlet farms generating no income at all. The family, in most instances, made the practical concession, accepting reduced rents, absorbing the loss into an already strained account, and hoping that conditions would improve more rapidly than they did. The response to this erosion of income followed a pattern common to landed families of the period, and its logic, however understandable in context, compounded the difficulty it was intended to address. Borrowing against the security of the estate's land was an established practice with a long history among the aristocracy, and the mechanisms for doing so, mortgage instruments, family loans advanced against future inheritance, bonds secured on the estate's rental income, were well developed and widely used. The initial borrowings undertaken by this family were modest in scale and clearly intended as short-term measures to bridge a temporary gap between income and expenditure. But temporary measures, when the conditions that produced them persist, have a tendency to become permanent arrangements, and the interest obligations attached to each successive loan added a further fixed cost to an annual budget that was already under pressure. The debt grew not through recklessness, but through the accumulation of reasonable responses to unreasonable circumstances. The social obligations that the estate carried were not easily renegotiated without cost to the family's standing. To reduce the scale of the annual shooting party, to close certain rooms of the house to reduce heating and staffing costs, to limit the number of seasons spent in London, all of these were practical economies, but each carried a social signal that the family was acutely aware of. In a world where the appearance of prosperity itself was a component of social authority, visible retrenchment risked accelerating the very decline it was designed to arrest. Creditors, political allies, and prospective matrimonial partners all read the surface of an estate with considerable attention, and a house that showed signs of diminishment invited a reassessment of the family's position that could have consequences extending well beyond the purely financial. The pressure to maintain appearances was therefore not mere vanity. It was a considered, if ultimately unsustainable, strategy for preserving the social capital on which the family's continued functioning depended. The estate's land itself was examined during this period with a new and more utilitarian attention. Parcels that had been held without particular productive purpose, woodland, ornamental grounds, outlying farms of marginal agricultural value, were assessed for their potential sale value with a practicality that earlier generations would not have needed to apply. In some cases, sales proceeded quietly, the proceeds absorbed into the general account with little formal acknowledgement of what their disposal represented. In other cases, the legal constraints of the family's settlement documents prevented outright sale and required instead more complex arrangements, long leases, mineral rights agreements, or the mortgaging of specific parcels that generated income without technically diminishing the estate's formal extent. The solicitors who managed these transactions did so with the discretion their clients required, and the documentary record of this period is notable as much for what it omits as for what it records. What the ledgers of this era reveal, read in their totality and across sufficient time, is the portrait of an institution caught between two irreconcilable demands. The demand of the past, which required that the estate be maintained in the form and at the standard its history prescribed, and the demand of the present, which made that maintenance progressively more difficult to sustain. The polished facades remained. The formal portraits continued to regard the entrance hall with their customary authority, but the silence behind them had acquired, across these decades, a weight and a quality that those who listened carefully could not entirely mistake for peace. Every great estate rested upon a foundation of human labor that its architecture was not designed to make visible. The principal rooms, the formal gardens, the polished entrance hall with its carefully arranged portraits and its atmosphere of unhurried refinement, all of this was produced and maintained by a population of men and women whose own lives unfolded largely out of sight, in the back passages and service quarters, in the tenant farmhouses scattered across the estate's outlying acres, and in the workshops and yards where the practical work of keeping a large property functional was conducted from before dawn until well after the family had retired for the evening. The estate's grandeur was, in the most literal sense, a collective production, the accumulated result of countless individual acts of labor, skill, and obligation performed across decades by people whose names appear only sporadically in the formal record and whose experiences must be reconstructed from the fragmentary evidence that survives. The domestic staff occupied a world that existed in close physical proximity to the family while remaining socially and spatially distinct from it. The architecture of the house enforced this distinction with considerable precision. Service corridors ran parallel to the principal passages, allowing staff to move through the building without crossing the formal routes used by the family and their guests. The back staircase connected the kitchen quarters to the upper floors through a route entirely separate from the grand staircase that rose through the entrance hall. The servants' hall, where the indoor staff took their meals in a hierarchy that mirrored, in miniature, the social order of the household above, was positioned to be both functionally convenient and acoustically removed from the rooms it served. These spatial arrangements were not incidental. They expressed in stone and timber and plaster a set of social assumptions about the proper ordering of a household that the architecture both reflected and reinforced. The working lives of the indoor staff were defined by a combination of physical demand and strict procedural regularity. The housemaids who cleaned the principal rooms rose before the household and worked through the early morning hours to ensure that fires were lit, grates were cleared, and surfaces were attended to before the family descended. The footmen who stood in the dining room during formal meals and who carried coal and water through the house across the course of the day performed labor of considerable physical exertion beneath an exterior of trained composure. The kitchen staff operated in conditions of sustained intensity, particularly during the periods of house parties and seasonal entertaining when the volume of work expanded dramatically and the hours between the preparation of breakfast and the completion of the last dinner service left little time for rest. The wages paid for this labor were modest by any standard, supplemented in part by accommodation, food, and the particular security that came with employment in an established household, a security that many domestic servants valued precisely because the alternatives available to working people of the period offered considerably less of it. The tenant farmers who occupied the estate's outlying holdings existed within a different but equally structured relationship with the family. Their tenancies were typically annual or longer-term arrangements, renewed through a combination of formal legal instrument and the accumulated goodwill of a working relationship that in many cases extended across multiple generations of the same family on both sides of the agreement. The farmhouses and agricultural buildings they occupied were the property of the estate, maintained in theory, if not always in practice, by the landlord, while the tenant provided the labor, the livestock, the equipment, and the agricultural knowledge that made the land productive. This division of responsibility created a relationship of mutual dependency that was understood by both parties, even when it was not always managed with equal fairness. The tenant relied on the landlord for the fabric of the farm and for a degree of protection against the worst consequences of bad harvests or market downturns. The landlord relied on the tenant for the rental income that sustained the estate's broader operation and for the practical agricultural management of land that the family itself had neither the time nor the knowledge to farm directly. The groundskeepers, gamekeepers, woodsmen, and outdoor laborers who maintained the estate's landscape occupied yet another distinct position within this layered human geography. Their work was seasonal in its rhythms but continuous in its demands, following the agricultural and sporting calendar with a precision that required both specialized knowledge and physical endurance. The head gamekeeper, responsible for the management of the shooting grounds and the presentation of the annual sport that was so central to the estate's social life, held a position of considerable local authority and was answerable directly to the family in a way that placed him outside the normal hierarchy of the domestic staff. The woodsmen who managed the estate's timber, the ditch diggers and hedgers who maintained the boundaries and drainage of the agricultural land, and the casual laborers engaged at harvest time or for specific construction projects formed the outermost layer of the estate's human system, present when needed, largely invisible in the formal record, and essential to the functioning of everything above them. As the economic conditions of the estate began to change, the human relationships that sustained it changed in correspondence. Reduced rental income led to deferred maintenance on tenant farmhouses, creating a quiet deterioration in the physical conditions of agricultural life on the estate that tenants noted with increasing dissatisfaction. Staff numbers in the house were reduced gradually, the departures of retiring servants not replaced with the automatic regularity of earlier decades, and those who remained were asked to cover a wider range of duties than their predecessors had been expected to manage. The social contract that governed these relationships, the understanding that the estate would provide security and maintenance in exchange for labor and loyalty, began to show the strain of an institution whose resources were no longer comfortably equal to its obligations. These changes did not produce immediate rupture. The human architecture of the estate was, like the physical architecture that surrounded it, built to absorb considerable stress before showing visible signs of failure. But the accommodations being made, the small reductions and quiet adjustments accumulating across the years, told a story that those living within the system understood with a clarity that the estate's formal exterior did not reflect.
The withdrawal of empire is rarely a sudden event. It does not announce itself with the precision of a single legislative act or the finality of a military defeat, though both of these may form part of its broader composition. It proceeds instead through an accumulation of smaller adjustments, policy revisions, institutional reorganizations, the quiet redistribution of resources and attention toward priorities that the old order had not anticipated and could not easily accommodate. For the families who had built their position within the structures that empire provided, this process of withdrawal presented a challenge of a particular kind. It was not the challenge of responding to a clear and identifiable crisis, but the more demanding challenge of adapting to a transformation whose full extent was only legible in retrospect, and whose individual components could each be absorbed, explained, or minimized in isolation, while their combined direction remained, for a time, genuinely uncertain. The political changes that most directly affected the standing of landed families during this period operated at the level of the legislature and the administrative state. The reform of parliamentary representation, which had been advancing in stages across the preceding decades, reached a point during this era at which the connection between land ownership and political influence was formally and substantially altered. The rotten boroughs and pocket constituencies through which landed patrons had exercised a disproportionate influence over the composition of the legislature were progressively eliminated or reformed, and the electorate was expanded in ways that introduced new and less predictable constituencies into the political calculus. For a family whose political authority had rested, in significant measure, on their ability to deliver votes and place candidates, this reorganization represented a structural diminishment that no amount of social prestige could entirely compensate. The financial policies of the state during this period placed additional pressure on the estates of the landed class through mechanisms that were rarely presented as hostile in intent, but whose practical effect was consistently to transfer resources from the inherited wealth of the aristocracy toward the requirements of an expanding public infrastructure. Taxation on land, on income derived from land, and eventually on the transfer of estates between generations through inheritance, all increased across this period, each increment modest enough to be managed in isolation, but collectively representative of a sustained and directional shift in the fiscal relationship between the state and the propertied class. The estate's annual accounts registered these changes as a series of growing deductions from revenues that were themselves already under pressure from the agricultural conditions described in earlier decades. The arithmetic of the household budget became, with each passing year, a more demanding exercise. The territorial contractions that affected the empire at its outermost edges had consequences for landed families that were less immediately visible but no less real. Commercial relationships, investment opportunities, and the flow of capital from colonial enterprises had, across the preceding century, provided an important supplement to the agricultural and rental income on which estates like this one formally depended. As imperial trade routes were disrupted, as colonial administrations were reorganized or relinquished, and as the political risks associated with overseas investment increased, these supplementary income streams became less reliable and in some cases disappeared entirely. The families who had quietly diversified their financial interests into colonial commerce found that the imperial withdrawal, which affected their political position, was simultaneously eroding a financial foundation whose extent they had not always fully acknowledged in their own accounts. The dismantling of aristocratic privilege proceeded through legal and institutional channels that were, individually, difficult to oppose with any appearance of principled consistency. The reform of the House of Lords, the erosion of the automatic social deference that had accompanied title and land in earlier generations, the expansion of professional and commercial routes to social respectability that did not require inherited property as their foundation, all of these developments altered the cultural landscape within which the estate existed and drew its meaning. The house had been built to communicate a specific set of social facts to a specific audience, operating within a specific set of assumptions. As those assumptions shifted, the communication became less legible, its intended meaning less automatically received by those who now formed the estate's social environment. The family's response to these accumulated withdrawals followed the pattern of adaptation that had served earlier generations in their own moments of external pressure. Connections to the new administrative structures of the expanding state were cultivated where possible, with younger sons directed toward careers in the civil service, the law, or the officer class of a military that was being reorganized along more professionally meritocratic lines. The political relationships that the estate's social life had traditionally sustained were maintained, even as their character shifted from the frank exchange of patronage and influence toward the more indirect cultivation of goodwill and association. The house continued to receive guests of consequence, and the family continued to occupy the physical and social center of the locality, but the terms on which that centrality rested were different from what they had been, and those most closely involved in managing the estate's affairs were aware of the difference, even when they did not discuss it openly. The estate itself and its physical presence remained largely unchanged through this period of institutional contraction. The principal rooms were maintained, the grounds continued to be managed, the fabric of the house was kept in sufficient repair to preserve its appearance of permanence and solidity. But the relationship between the building and the world around it had altered in ways that the building's exterior could not register. The estate had been constructed as the visible expression of a specific form of social authority, one grounded in land, in hereditary title, in the patronage networks of an imperial political culture, and in the cultural assumptions of a class that understood itself as the natural governing stratum of the national life. Each of these foundations had been, by the period this chapter addresses, either removed or substantially weakened. The house stood where it had always stood. The empire from which it had drawn its deepest meaning was, in the most consequential sense, beginning to look elsewhere. What remained was the building itself, the land it occupied, and the family whose identity had become so thoroughly entangled with both that the question of what they were without them had not yet been fully asked. That question would, in time, require an answer. There is a particular historical position that certain generations are required to occupy, not through any failure of their own making, but through the simple circumstance of having arrived at the point where accumulated pressures finally exceed the capacity of inherited structures to contain them. The last generation to occupy this estate in its full historic form did not choose to be the last. They inherited a house, a landscape, a set of social obligations, and a financial condition that had been shaped by decisions made across centuries, and they brought to the management of that inheritance the same combination of personal temperament, available resources, and historical circumstance that had governed every generation before them. What distinguished their position was not the nature of their challenges, but their timing. The fact that the adjustments and adaptations that earlier generations had managed to defer had, by the period of their tenure, accumulated into a set of conditions that could no longer be deferred without consequence. The individuals who formed this final generation were, by the accounts available to historians, neither exceptional nor inadequate. They were educated in the manner their class prescribed, formed by the institutions, the schools, the universities, the military regiments, the London clubs that had shaped the sensibility and the social reflexes of the landed gentry across generations.
They understood the estate as their predecessors had understood it, as an inheritance that carried obligations alongside its privileges, as a physical and social institution whose continuity was a responsibility rather than merely an entitlement. What they encountered upon assuming the management of the property was the full accumulated weight of the financial, agricultural, and political pressures that the preceding chapters of this story have traced, not as a sudden revelation, but as a condition they had grown up within and had understood at some level from an early age to be the defining feature of their situation. The eldest son, who inherited the estate at the opening of this final chapter, made his first significant decisions in a spirit of measured optimism that the historical record suggests was genuine rather than performative. He engaged a land agent of considerable professional reputation to conduct a thorough review of the estate's agricultural holdings and their income-generating potential under modernized management practices. He corresponded with architects about the possibility of adopting certain wings of the house to reduce their maintenance costs without compromising the integrity of the principal rooms. He investigated with varying degrees of seriousness the possibility of introducing commercial activities to the estate, the letting of shooting rights on a more formal commercial basis, the development of certain outlying parcels for residential purposes, the exploitation of timber resources that had been managed conservatively across the preceding decades. These were not the responses of a man indifferent to his inheritance. They were the practical calculations of someone attempting to find, within the constraints available to him, a path toward the estate's continued viability. Some of these initiatives produced modest results. The commercial letting of the shooting rights introduced a new category of visitor to the estate, wealthy men from industrial and commercial backgrounds whose relationship to the land was one of purchased leisure rather than inherited obligation, and whose presence represented, in social terms, a quiet but unmistakable shift in the character of the household's seasonal life. The timber sales generated useful capital at the cost of altering the appearance of the estate's woodland in ways that the family found aesthetically and sentimentally difficult. The architectural consultations produced reports of considerable thoroughness that were read carefully and then, for the most part, set aside, the costs of implementation exceeding, in almost every case, the resources available to meet them. The younger members of the generation pursued lives that took them, to varying degrees, away from the estate and the mode of existence it represented. Careers in the colonial service, in law, in the officer class of the military, and in the newer professions that the expanding economy had made available to men of education provided alternatives to the management of a financially constrained rural property that many found both practically necessary and personally compelling. The pull of London, of professional engagement, of a world organized around individual achievement rather than inherited position, was felt across this generation with a force that their grandparents would not have recognized as a competing claim upon their attention. The estate remained the family's symbolic center, the place to which they returned at intervals and to which their identity remained attached, but it was no longer, for many of them, the primary feeder of their lives. The women of this generation occupied a historical moment in which the possibilities available to them were expanding in ways that created their own particular tensions with the demands of estate life. The management of a large household, the maintenance of the social relationships that the estate's position required, and the expectation of a domestic role defined primarily by the needs of the property and the family, were all conditions that sat uneasily alongside the altered social landscape of the era, one in which education, professional engagement, and civic participation were becoming, however gradually, recognized as legitimate dimensions of a woman's life. The responses to this tension varied across individuals, from those who found genuine fulfillment in the traditional role to those who managed its demands alongside a growing engagement with the public world that the previous generation would not have considered available to them. What united this final generation beneath the diversity of their individual responses was a shared awareness that the estate's future was not assured in the form they had inherited it. This awareness was not spoken of with the directness that later generations might bring to such a recognition. It was present instead in the quality of the decisions being made, in the particular combination of practical calculation and emotional attachment that characterized the family's engagement with the property during these years, and in the growing frequency with which conversations about the estate's future shifted from questions of improvement to questions of preservation, from what could be built upon to what could be held. To preserve what you have inherited, when preservation itself requires sustained effort and diminishing resources, is neither failure nor resignation. It is a form of custodianship that history has not always recognized with the seriousness it deserves. This generation held the estate as long as they were able, and the manner in which they held it reflected with considerable faithfulness both the weight of what they had received and the honest limits of what remained possible.
The ending of a great estate is rarely a single event. It does not occur on a particular day or through a single decisive act, however much the documentary record might later suggest otherwise. What the formal instruments of transfer, the sale agreements, the auction catalogs, the probate inventories, the conveyancing documents, capture is the legal conclusion of a process that had been underway for considerably longer, its momentum building through the accumulated decisions and deferred resolutions of the preceding decades. By the time the dispersal of this estate became a matter of public record, the outcome had already been determined by forces and choices whose origins lay well behind the moment of formal dissolution. The paperwork recorded an ending. The ending itself had been in preparation for years. The first significant disposals were of the outlying land, the peripheral farms and parcels that had been acquired across generations through the patient accumulation described in the earlier chapters of this story, and that now, under the pressure of changed circumstances, were released in approximately the reverse order of their acquisition. The farms furthest from the principal house, those whose connection to the estate's core identity was most attenuated and whose management had become most difficult to sustain at a distance, were offered first. Their sale was managed through land agents with a discretion that reflected the family's awareness of the signals such transactions carried, and the prices achieved, while adequate, were lower than the land might have commanded in an earlier era of agricultural prosperity. The proceeds were absorbed into the estate's general accounts, reducing the burden of debt without eliminating it, and the estate contracted quietly around its remaining core. The contents of the house presented a different and, in many respects, more publicly legible form of dispersal. The accumulated objects of several centuries, the furniture, the silver, the porcelain, the library, the paintings that had hung in the principal rooms since the estate's construction, and the works acquired across subsequent generations through purchase, commission, and inheritance, were inventoried with the thoroughness that legal and financial necessity required. The resulting catalogue, preserved in the records of the auction house engaged to conduct the sale, constitutes one of the most detailed documents available for understanding the material culture of the estate at the height of its completeness. Room by room, the inventory proceeds with the methodical precision of a professional valuation, assigning to each object a description and an estimated worth that translates the accumulated aesthetic and sentimental life of the household into the neutral language of commercial transaction. The auction itself, conducted across several days at the house and subsequently at the rooms of the London house in the city, drew buyers of varied description and motivation. Collectors of established reputation attended for the paintings and the more significant pieces of furniture, their agents bidding with the practiced restraint of those for whom such sales represented routine professional activity. Dealers from the metropolitan trade acquired silver and porcelain in quantities that suggested resale rather than personal collection. Local families of means attended in part from curiosity, in part from genuine interest in objects whose history was known to them through long association, and acquired pieces whose value to them was as much memorial as aesthetic. The library was purchased largely intact by an institutional buyer whose interest in the collection was scholarly rather than personal, preserving in that particular instance a coherence that the rest of the dispersal did not achieve.
The land that formed the estate's agricultural core passed through a more extended process of transfer that unfolded across several years rather than several days. Individual farms were sold to their sitting tenants where those tenants possessed the means to purchase, creating in a single transaction a transformation of tenure that the political reformers of the preceding generation had argued for in principle, but that was now occurring through the mechanism of private sale rather than legislative compulsion. Other parcels were acquired by neighboring landowners engaged in consolidating their own holdings, the estate's dissolution contributing to the expansion of properties that had themselves been built through a similar process of patient accumulation in earlier centuries. The land remained productive. It remained inhabited and worked. What changed was the relationship between the land and the family whose identity had been so thoroughly constructed around it. The principal house presented the most complex challenge of the entire dissolution. Its scale, its condition, and the cost of its maintenance made it unsuitable for straightforward private sale to a single buyer of the kind that might have absorbed a smaller property without difficulty. Several potential purchasers examined the house during the period of its availability and withdrew upon closer consideration of what its acquisition would require. The negotiations that eventually produced a resolution were extended and complicated, involving legal representatives, surveyors, and intermediaries whose correspondence fills a substantial portion of the estate's final archival record. The terms ultimately agreed upon reflected the reduced expectations of a family whose negotiating position had contracted considerably from what it might have been in an earlier decade. The formal dissolution of the household as a functioning institution proceeded through the departure of the remaining staff, those who had continued in service through the final years of reduced circumstances and who now received their characters, their references, and in some cases modest gratuities that the family's constrained finances could barely support. Their dispersal into other situations and other households was managed with the care that a family with a long tradition of obligation toward those who served them considered appropriate, and several of the longer-serving members of the household found positions through the intervention of family connections that remained, even at this late stage, of some practical use. What the auction catalogs and transfer documents cannot record is the texture of the rooms as the objects were removed from them, the particular quality of light in the drawing room once the paintings were gone, the altered acoustics of the library after the shelves were cleared, the appearance of the entrance hall without the furniture that had given it its specific character for as long as anyone associated with the property could remember. These were not historical facts in any recoverable sense. They were the private experience of an ending, witnessed by those present and carried away with them when they left, leaving the house to its altered silence. A building that has been vacated by the life that gave it meaning does not immediately become something else. There is an interval, sometimes brief, sometimes extended across years, during which it occupies a condition of suspension, its original purpose exhausted and its future purpose not yet determined, its rooms emptied of the furniture and the human activity that had animated them, but still carrying, in their proportions and their materials, and the particular quality of light that moves through their windows across the course of a day, the full legible record of what they were designed to be. This estate entered that interval at the conclusion of the family's occupation and remained within it long enough for the building to acquire, in the understanding of those who encountered it during that period, a quality that is difficult to name precisely, but that observers across different historical moments have consistently registered, the quality of a place that has not forgotten what it once was, even as the world around it has largely ceased to remember. The first institutional use to which the building was put following the family's departure reflected the practical requirements of an era in which large country houses were being absorbed across the country into the expanding infrastructure of public and semi-public institutions. The specific use varied with the period and the available demand, a wartime requisition that brought uniformed occupants in temporary partitions to rooms designed for entirely different purposes, a post-war conversion that adopted the principal floor to administrative use while the upper stories were left largely unoccupied, a period of educational occupation during which the former drawing rooms served as classrooms and the kitchen quarters were adopted to institutional catering, Each of these uses left its physical trace in the building's fabric. Partition walls of thin timber and plasterboard divided spaces that had been designed as single volumes. Linoleum and institutional carpeting was laid over original floorboards. Electrical conduits were chased into walls that had been plastered with considerable care by craftsmen working in a tradition of finish that their successors in the building trades had largely abandoned. The house absorbed these alterations with the passive acceptance of a structure built to last, though their cumulative effect on the quality of its interior was considerable. The periods of partial or full abandonment that punctuated the building's institutional history were, paradoxically, among the most revealing in terms of what they disclosed about the quality of the original construction. A roof neglected for a decade will fail in the sequence determined by its original design, the lead flashings at the most complex junctions failing first, the valley gutters accumulating debris until they overflow, the water finding its way through the parapet copings and into the wall cavities behind. The pattern of water damage that developed across the building's abandoned periods traced, with unintentional precision, the hierarchy of the original builder's priorities. The principal facade maintained with the heaviest and most durable materials, the service ranges and secondary elevations constructed to a standard that was adequate rather than exceptional, and that showed the consequences of neglect more quickly. The house's deterioration was, in this sense, a form of structural autobiography. The fabric of the principal rooms retained beneath the accumulated alterations of institutional occupation a remarkable degree of its original character. The plasterwork of the entrance hall ceiling, though discolored by damp and obscured in places by the intervention of later fixtures, preserved the full geometry of its original design, the shallow relief of its decorative panels, the precise molding profiles of its cornices, the careful modulation of its surface from the flat fields between the ribs to the more elaborately worked central section directly above the point where visitors had once paused to receive the full effect of the composition. The stone chimney pieces that anchored the principal reception rooms had survived intact, their carved surfaces recording in miniature the stylistic preferences of the period in which they were made with a fidelity that no later intervention had been able to entirely efface. The staircase, its balusters thinned by generations of hands moving along its rail, and its treads worn in the particular pattern produced by decades of ascending and descending feet, rose through the house with the unhurried authority of a structure that had been built with full confidence in its own permanence. Those who encountered the building during its various phases of repurposing and partial abandonment brought to it the particular sensibility of their own historical moment. The wartime occupants, for whom the commandeering of great houses was a routine administrative necessity, engaged with the building primarily as a practical resource, a collection of usable spaces, heated rooms, and available storage whose aesthetic character was largely irrelevant to their purposes. The post-war administrators who managed its conversion to institutional use occupied an era in which the country house was widely regarded as a social anachronism, whose physical survival was a matter of limited public concern, and their alterations reflected an indifference to the building's original character that later generations would find difficult to fully comprehend. The educational occupants who followed brought something closer to appreciation, if not always the resources or the mandate to act upon it, and it is to this period that several of the more considered efforts at maintenance and minor restoration can be attributed. The landscape that surrounded the house underwent its own transformation across these decades of altered occupancy. The formal gardens, which had required a substantial and specialized labor force to maintain at their design standard, contracted rapidly once that labor force was no longer available. The geometric parterres that had once been visible from the principal reception rooms became indistinguishable from the surrounding grassland within a surprisingly short period. The ornamental trees that had been planted along the principal axes of the garden design grew beyond the scale for which they had been intended, their canopies now meeting overhead to create a quality of enclosed shadow that was not part of the original intention, but that has become through the accumulation of decades an authentic feature of the place. The kitchen garden walls, built of brick fired from local clay and laid with considerable precision, remained standing long after the productive gardens they had enclosed had reverted to rough grass and self-seeded woodland. What the walls of this building remembered by the time its history reached the period of renewed attention that preservation and historical interest eventually brought to it was not a single moment or a single identity, but the full accumulated record of everything that had acted upon them. They remembered the original intention of their construction, the social world for which they had been designed, the family whose identity they had housed, and every subsequent use, neglect, and partial restoration through which they had passed. Buildings of sufficient age and quality become, in this way, their own most complete historical document, recording in their fabric what no written account can fully capture, and preserving in the texture of their surfaces and the geometry of their spaces the particular weight of the time through which they have stood.
History is not a complete record. It is a selection, shaped by the priorities of those who compiled it, the survival of the materials from which it was constructed, and the questions that successive generations considered worth asking of the past. The estates and families that appear prominently in the official historical record do so for reasons that are not always straightforwardly connected to their actual significance in the life of their era. They appear because they were associated with events that later historiography deemed decisive, because their documents survived in accessible archives, because a descendant with literary inclinations produced a memoir, or because the aesthetic quality of their house attracted the attention of architectural historians at a moment when such attention translated into preservation and publication. The estates that do not appear, the ones that declined quietly, whose papers were dispersed or destroyed, whose houses were demolished or converted beyond recognition, whose families simply ceased to occupy the position they had once held without any single dramatic episode to mark the transition, these are absent not because they mattered less, but because the mechanisms of historical memory did not, for one reason or another, engage with them at the moment when engagement would have made a difference. This estate belongs to that second category. Its absence from the standard narratives of the period in which it flourished is not a judgment on its historical significance. It is a reflection of the particular circumstances of its decline, the gradualism of its dissolution, the discretion with which its difficulties were managed, and the absence of any sufficiently dramatic episode to attract the retrospective attention of historians working from the more visible peaks of the historical landscape. The family did not produce a figure of national political prominence, whose biography would have drawn researchers to the estate's records. The house was not designed by an architect of sufficient celebrity to generate the kind of scholarly interest that preserves documentation. The collection dispersed at auction contained no single work of art sufficiently famous to leave a trail of provenance research leading back to the house. The estate existed, flourished, and declined within the broad middle register of aristocratic and landed life, significant within its own locality and its own social world, largely invisible to the machinery of official commemoration. What such estates represent, taken collectively, is a dimension of the historical past that formal records consistently underrepresent. The country was shaped, across the centuries this story covers, not only by the great houses whose names appear in architectural surveys and political histories, but by the hundreds of properties of middling scale and local significance whose combined influence on land use, agricultural practice, social organization, and the physical character of the rural landscape was, in aggregate, considerably greater than that of any individual famous example. The tenant farmers who worked the land of estates like this one, the tradespeople whose livelihoods depended on the household's requirements, the staff whose working lives unfolded within its service corridors, and the local communities whose social and economic rhythms were organized in relation to the estate's calendar, all of these people lived within a structure whose historical significance is not adequately captured by its absence from the published record. The question of how legacy is formed and how it is lost is one that this estate raises with particular clarity precisely because its own legacy is so attenuated. Legacy, in the context of the landed estate, was understood by those who built and maintained such properties as something that the physical structure itself would guarantee, that stone and timber and carefully maintained grounds would preserve the family's name and significance against the erosion of time in a way that no purely social or political achievement could match.
The building was the argument for permanence, the material evidence that the family had existed and mattered, visible to any observer who passed through the landscape and capable of making its case without the intervention of any written document or institutional memory. This confidence in the persuasive power of physical permanence was not unreasonable in the era in which it was formed. It simply did not account for the possibility that the structures of interpretation through which a building communicated its meaning might prove less durable than the building itself. To stand in what remains of this estate today is to encounter a place that carries its history in a form that requires attention and patience to read. The legibility that the house once possessed, its ability to communicate immediately and without ambiguity the social position and historical weight of the family it represented, has been compromised by the alterations of subsequent occupation, by the contraction of the cultural knowledge that once made its architectural language universally intelligible to its intended audience, and by the simple passage of time. What remains is not the complete statement that the original builders intended, but something more fragmentary, and in its fragmentation, more honest, a partial text that rewards careful reading precisely because it does not offer its meanings immediately or without effort. The landscape that surrounds the building has returned, in many areas, to something approximating the character it possessed before the estate's formal gardens imposed their geometric order upon it. The trees that were planted along the principal avenues have matured beyond the scale their designers envisioned, their canopies now meeting overhead to create a quality of enclosed shadow that was not part of the original intention, but that has become, through the accumulation of decades, an authentic feature of the place. The fields that were once managed as part of the estate's agricultural operation are farmed by different hands under different arrangements, their boundaries still faintly legible in the landscape as evidence of a system of land management that has otherwise largely disappeared. The streams run through the same channels they have always occupied, indifferent to the human histories that have unfolded in the landscape above them. What this estate represents, finally, is not the exceptional, but the representative, a story that belongs to a category of historical experience so widespread that its very commonness has contributed to its invisibility. It is the story of how power is constructed, sustained, and eventually relinquished, told not through the lives of those who shaped national events, but through the patient accumulation of ordinary decisions made by people who were, in the fullest sense, of their time. The walls carry that story still, in the only language available to them, the language of material, of proportion, of light falling at a particular angle through windows that have faced the same landscape for centuries, registering without judgment everything that has passed before them and preserving in their enduring substance the irreplaceable record of a world that no longer exists, but was, while it lasted, entirely and completely real.